Good afternoon, and welcome to the Drivewyze webinar, Secrets Behind the Way Station, What Happens When Your Trucks Pull In. I am Haley Evans, Manager of Events at Randall Riley, and it is our pleasure to have you all here for what is sure to be an informative session. Soon you will hear from Veteran Law Enforcement Officer Doug Hatch and Drivewyze Vice President of Government Experience, Brian Mofford, who will be speaking about modern roadside inspections. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few things that will help us get the most out of this webinar. To view the full presentation, click the orange arrow on the Grab tab on the top left control panel to minimize the panel. This will place a tab on the top right of your screen and will enable you to see the entire presentation. We would like to encourage questions. To ask questions, bring your control panel back by clicking the orange arrow and type your question in the box that says, "Enter a question for the staff." We will answer these questions at the end of the session. Thank you for attending today, and make sure that you ask questions as they arrive. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers. As I mentioned earlier, Doug Hatch is a training consultant at Drivewyze and a retired DPS captain. He spent 25 years in the Texas Department of Public Safety, serving 18 years in the commercial vehicle enforcement. Doug then joined Drivewyze team in 2015 and now teaches law enforcement how to implement and use Drivewyze way station bypass service. Doug, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Haley.
Our second speaker today is Brian Mofford, who is the Vice President of Government Experience at Drivewyze. Brian is a subject matter expert in cloud computing, web client interfaces, and geolocation data management. While working at Drivewyze, Brian has built many successful relationships with state law enforcement agencies. Brian, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Haley.
As a reminder, you can submit questions in the control panel at any time during the duration of this webinar. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Brian.
Thanks again, Haley. As Haley mentioned, my name is Brian Mofford. I'm the Vice President of Government Experience here at Drivewyze. I've joined Drivewyze. Drivewyze is a parent company, Intelligent Imaging Systems, which has been around since 2003. And I joined that company back in 2010. From there, the concept of Drivewyze was established, and I moved over to the new company from day one. So I've had a chance to see the Drivewyze program expand from concept to the largest way station bypass program available today in North America. So today we're going to talk about a couple of different things. First, I'll just give you a brief history of IIS and Drivewyze. We'll then get into the different technologies being used in the way station for screening vehicles. And then from there, I'll bring on Doug. I've got a few questions that we commonly hear from industry that I'll start with. And then from there, we'll open it up to you folks, and hopefully we'll be able to get through on all the questions that you might have. So as I mentioned, IIS, the parent company, has been around for a number of years, since 2003. It started off as a technology provider, focusing primarily on sensors. But in 2009, IIS launched its first software platform called Smart Roadside, which I will get into a little bit more specifics here in some of the coming slides. Late 2010, early 2011, IIS began to evaluate, the existing way station bypass programs that were out there, all of which involved using hardware-based transponders and readers on the side of the pole at the side of the roadside. And we were trying to see if these programs could be extended using the advances being realized in mobile and wireless technologies. That's where the idea Drivewyze sprang from, and it was launched in the summer of 2012 on mobile platforms, and then extended to electronic logging devices inside the cabs of trucks beginning in 2013. 2014 saw additional advancements in some of the IIS technologies. IIS launched the first commercially available automated thermal imaging system, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit more detail in a few slides. And then from there, Drivewyze continues to grow. As of today, you can see from the coverage map, Drivewyze is available in 42 U.S. states, and we're available in one Canadian province, and we're looking forward to launching in our second Canadian province of Ontario later this year. So on the industry side, anybody who has dealt with us in the past or is evaluating Drivewyze today has probably dealt with some of our industry representatives. We have the same level of support and effort that goes into supporting our commercial vehicle enforcement agencies as well. So as you can see, we've got a number of teams spread out across Canada and the United States that are onboarding our enforcement agency partners, are training them up in the field, are installing the technologies that might be needed as part of the screening process, and then helping them on a day-to-day basis when it comes to the operation of the bypass programs in their jurisdictions. Got a couple of poll questions, not too many. This is the first one, so hopefully you'll see a yes or no question pop up on your screen there. I'll ask everybody to submit your answer. I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, how's that going?
We have 57% say yes and 43% say no.
Great, great. Yeah, the adoption of way station bypass services has greatly improved over the last 5 years. Prior to Drivewyze entering the market, we saw penetration of way station bypass to be very low in the industry. And we're proud that the inclusion of Drivewyze into the market has really helped raise awareness of way station bypass and what it is, and has drastically improved adoption in the industry. So when it comes to way station bypass, what are we checking? So first off, the screening criteria used by an enforcement agency is at the sole discretion of the enforcement agency. So what you see on the screen here are some of the common parameters that enforcement is checking for, and the top left-hand corner there is our credentials that every single agency is getting today. So ISS score, or sometimes referred to as SMS, your SMS basics. Well, your ISS score reflects the overall safety profile of the carrier or the fleet that you might be driving for. And it's on a range of 1 to 99, 100 being out of service. And so the higher your score, the worse off your safety history is. And a lot of our enforcement agencies use a range of bypass rates associated to those scores. So typically, if your ISS score is below 75, you're receiving very favorable bypass rates, and then it scales down from there as it goes up. Of course, license plate and VIN of the vehicles are important for us to be able to screen against registration, permitting, taxes, whatever else that jurisdiction may be interested in. And of course, USDOT number is what we use to find the ISS score from the federal FMCSA systems. A lot of states are also screening on additional permitting information like IRP, IFTA, UCR. Some states do require weight to be part of the bypass criteria. And in those sites, we've integrated our Drivewyze service with weight and motion scales installed in the main line. And then we also integrate with state-specific data sources. So in some instances, we may be checking against state permitting systems. What we don't screen on, we don't screen on specific driver information. So hours of service, medical records, CDL, that information is not part of the screening process. What you see on the screen here is a snapshot of what the enforcement agencies would see inside their weigh stations. So the information is transmitted to our back-end systems where we measure all the credentials from the fleet and from the vehicle against the screening criteria for that particular site that the vehicle's approaching. So we're transmitting an image of the vehicle, the license plate, the DOT number, and then the results of all the different screening criteria that are being used by that jurisdiction. If there's any information that requires a closer look by the enforcement officers, a message is provided to the enforcement officer in the station, and that vehicle will be told to pull in unless the station is closed. Another quick poll question: true or false? Weigh station bypass programs are used by law enforcement to track drivers and issue more citations. So I'll give you a moment to answer that. Okay. So
we have 18% true and 83% false.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So yeah, the answer is false. Law enforcement, they use these bypass systems as a way to award those fleets carriers that have a good safety history and are working on improving their overall safety ratings. The vehicle information that's transmitted at the weigh stations is only transmitted at the weigh stations, so the software is not sending constant information on the truck to those law enforcement agencies. Law enforcement agencies can see what weigh stations you visited within the state or within their jurisdiction, but not from neighboring jurisdictions. They can only see their own jurisdictional information, and they cannot use the system to give you a citation. So one of the common questions we get is, can a law enforcement agency use the location information to give a driver a speeding ticket? And the answer is no. For a citation to be given for speeding, the way or method that enforcement uses to determine whether or not a truck is speeding has to be accepted by the courts. And of course, weigh station bypass systems have not been accepted by courts as a valid means to determine if somebody's been speeding. So first, we'll talk a little bit more about the weigh station technologies that we're seeing enforcement use. Now, these are technologies being used inside the station. So while you may be participating in a bypass program and the screening is done on the main line, should you be told to pull in, or if you're not using any bypass programs today, as your truck enters the ramp onto the weigh station, there's a number of sensors inside these scale houses that are used to give the officers inside the scale house a snapshot of both your vehicle and the safety history of the carrier you're driving for. Here's a number of different technologies in use today. IIS, the sister company here of Drivewyze, is in the business of all of these different sensors. We've pioneered some of them, and we've got a number of patents on the evolution of some of this technology that you see here. So thermal inspection is interesting. It's one of the first sensors that IIS started with back in 2003. Essentially, thermal inspection technology can take the heat sense, a thermal signature of a vehicle, and what it does is it scans the axle of the vehicle as it's slowing down, coming into the ramp or anywhere where it might be braking. What that does is, as brakes engage, we know they heat up, and as they're heating up, the thermal cameras can pick up the heat signatures on these axles and look for anomalies. So certain heat signatures are predicted and expected. You can see by the image there in the bottom left-hand side that we would expect to see certain patterns around the vent holes of the tire, as well as from the brake pads as they're heating up. But if a vehicle's axle is showing to be a little too hot, or sometimes we might see sparks in the image, that could be an indication that there's a problem with the brakes. Flip side to that is if we see no heat signature whatsoever, the axle is showing cold. It could be the brakes are not engaging at all and may have failed on that particular axle, or possibly the vent holes of the rims are not aligned correctly. So that would give enforcement a reason to take a closer look at that vehicle's tire and or axles and brakes. Overview cameras. So some of these weigh stations are really busy, and there's a lot of traffic flowing in. And so one of the very first sensors that a truck typically passes by is an overhead camera. We'll just take an image of that camera, and then that image will be associated with all of the other data that comes off all the other sensors that we're talking about here. USDOT and license plate readers. These are common in a lot of facilities today. The license plate reader obviously scanning the front of the vehicle, pulling the license plate of that truck, and then using that information to search state and federal data sources to make sure that registration is up to date. It may check for permits and things like that as well. And then, of course, the USDOT number on the side of the vehicle. Now, there's no standard area for a USDOT number to be on the truck, on the side of the truck. So these cameras scan the entire side of the vehicle, finds the DOT number, decodes that, and then uses that to search for the fleet or the carrier in the federal systems, and that's where the safety score is coming from. Vehicle waveform identification. So I mentioned that on the overview cameras there, it's important for enforcement to be able to identify the truck visually. But then as those trucks proceed through the weigh stations, especially the bigger, busier weigh stations, sometimes those trucks are ordered to report into different lanes or inspection bays or things like that. So what vehicle waveform does is it takes a magnetic fingerprint of the truck as it's pulling into the station. And then that technology can be used to identify that vehicle anywhere within the scale house, including when that vehicle leaves the scale house. Enforcement typically uses that to ensure that vehicles are reporting to the appropriate lanes and responding accordingly to the variable message signs that may be inside these stations. Vehicle waveform ties in very nicely with lane control. So as we see in some of the larger inspection facilities, one ramp lane may turn into 4 lanes inside the station, and vehicles are automatically told which lanes to report to depending on what activities are happening in the inspection facility that day. And so the combination of vehicle waveform and lane control gives enforcement the ability to see that vehicles are following directions accordingly inside the station. And then I mentioned Smart Roadside. In 2009, IIS launched the Smart Roadside platform, which acts like a commercial vehicle enforcement management platform, if you will. This pulls all the information gathered from all those different roadside sensors that I've talked about, including others like weigh in motion, and gives enforcement a snapshot of that vehicle and the carrier by the time that truck has pulled up in front of the scale house. From here, enforcement can use that information or that data to make decisions on whether or not they want to do further inspections. So that's it in a nutshell on the technology side. I talked about both bypass, which is screening of the vehicle on the main line, and then technology used inside the weigh station. But of course, there is a third level of screening, and that's the folks that work inside the station themselves. So at this time, I'd invite Doug to jump on and join us here. And Doug, why don't you give us just a quick background on yourself and your time with Texas Department of Public Safety?
Well, as mentioned earlier, spent some time in the Highway Patrol, spent 25 years with the Department of Public Safety, and the last 18 was in the Commercial Vehicle Enforcement Division, and saw many changes in those 18 years. And like I say, it was a great career, and now it's time to move on to another one.
Sorry about that. Doug, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, great. So Doug, I talked about all these different technologies being used in screening. What value did you find when you were working in enforcement that these technologies provided you in your day-to-day?
Well, actually, as it grew and more technology came in, it allowed me to focus my efforts on the trucks that really needed to be looked at more. And what I mean by that is trucks that had a few more problems that need to be addressed than the ones that were actually working hard to be safe going down the highway.
So these technologies would give you a snapshot of the sort of the safety history of the carriers and or the vehicles. But beyond that, how much discretion do you as an officer have in deciding which trucks to pull in?
I believe most states are the same. The officers have a lot of discretion as which vehicles to stop and what enforcement action to actually take, whether it's if you stop them, whether you write a citation or a warning. That's usually left within the scope of each officer in their jurisdiction.
Right. All right. So one of the questions we get frequently is, does law enforcement have a quota when it comes to inspections and or citations?
No, they don't have a quota. If they did, the officer would jump for joy, and he would sue the state, and he'd be retired and living somewhere live on the beach and having a good time.
Good. All right. So since you have the discretion as these vehicles are pulling in, what type of indicators are you looking for when you're scanning these vehicles in the stations?
Well, there's several ways we choose a vehicle. Sometimes we have what we call the next truck up day, and basically we're not actually looking for any violations or anything like that. It's just as soon as we become available, we take the next truck up, and that's usually when we have more vehicles that will have better inspections, because we're not actually screening the vehicles or even really looking at them. We're just taking the next truck up. Next thing is we may be looking at the trucks to see if they have any weight violations. And if they have a weight violation, then we may pull them over and go ahead and do an inspection at that time. And then, of course, we're looking to see if there's any serious violations that we can detect at that particular point in time, whether load's not secured or a flat tire, anything like that as far as equipment related. But we're also making eye contact with the drivers, and we're looking at them. If they're look like they're extremely tired, well, that could be an indicator that they haven't got enough rest. If their dash is extremely cluttered and the truck is very dirty, they may not be paying as good attention to the maintenance of that vehicle. So they take all that into consideration before they decide which truck to actually stop.
Okay, we get a lot of questions around the whole citation process, and I've got a few of them for you here. Before I do that, though, I'll go ahead and invite folks in the audience to go ahead and start submitting your questions in the chat box of the webinar here, and we'll start sending them over to Doug here. But Doug, how do you decide whether to give out a warning or a citation?
That's usually based on the seriousness of the violation. You know, an out of service type violation, brakes not working over the percentage and putting the truck out of service, then you'd probably receive a citation for that. If it's a minor light violation, then you would probably receive a warning.
And do you make a decision on whether to fine the driver or the company?
Well, the way Texas law is written is all the citations go to the driver. We don't care who takes care of the citation, but the violation is actually written to the driver itself.
Okay, so they go to the driver, but a violation will affect not just the driver's CSA scores, but also the carrier's, correct?
That is correct. Any violation, whether it's a citation or warning, affects both the carrier's profile and the driver's profile.
Okay. Now, law enforcement, they monitor the carrier's profile, and that's done. Well, that information is provided by FMCSA. But does enforcement have the ability to also monitor scores of individual trucks?
No, they do not.
It's just the driver. It's just the driver or the carrier.
That's correct. When we look up a score, we just look up the carrier's profile. We actually do not look up the driver's profile as far as the ISS score.
That's okay. Can a violation be cleared from a driver's record?
Sure, there's a couple of ways it can be cleared from the record. If you can data queue it, and if they present enough evidence to get it withdrawn and changed from the inspection report, then that can be removed. If I believe they've actually changed it now that if they did receive a citation and they were not convicted of it, then that violation could also be removed. But other than that, it just takes time for a violation to come off.
Okay, great. One of the questions from the audience is, how do you determine whether or not to inspect rental vehicles like your Penske or Ryder trucks?
Well, it depends upon how they're being used. If they're being used in a move where it is a personal move, such as a family moving from one state to the next, then we will not inspect those vehicles. If the Penske is actually moving the vehicle from one location to the next, then the vehicle will go under Penske's carrier profile. If a company has rented the vehicle, then it will go under that company's profile.
Okay. So if it is being used for commercial purposes, then whoever rented the vehicle would be required to have their own DOT number, correct?
That is correct. They're not required to put it on there unless it's more than a 30-day rental.
Okay. Great. Okay. What kind of traffic do these weigh stations typically see?
That varies from station to station. I've seen some that might get 50 to 100 trucks in a day, and then there's others that get, 5 to 10,000 trucks a day. It just depends upon their location.
Right. So one of the questions we've got, and I could probably answer this, is around the CSA and or ISS scores. So for you folks listening, when it comes to screening in the Drivewyze bypass program, Drivewyze does not look at CSA scores. We just look at the ISS score. But of course, your ISS score is the result of math done on all the different CSA basics for a particular carrier, and that ISS score is determined by FMCSA, and that's where we pull that information from. So your score is a combination of different violations and numbers of inspections, and of course you are ranked into categories based on your fleet size as well. And those citations, if it's a vehicle or if it's a vehicle citation, they will affect your ISS score for up to 2 years. Of course, the weighting of the effect on your ISS score changes over time as well. So Doug, one of the questions we had was if a driver is driving a rental vehicle, how do you determine if they are commercial carriers?
Just by the driver interview, talking to the driver, seeing where they're going, what they're doing, things of that nature.
Yeah. In the case of bypass as well, if a commercial company could subscribe to bypass using a rented vehicle, but their DOT number that they provide to the Drivewyze system must be their own DOT number. If one of my drivers got on the scale and gets no violations, can he get into the next scale and get another clean inspection? So I think the question is could they be inspected, at more than one facility in the same trip? And I think the answer there is yes, right? Would you see it any different?
One more time on the question, Brian. I didn't quite hear the question.
Yeah. So the question is, if one of my drivers got to a scale, was inspected and got no violations, could he go into the next scale and get another clean inspection?
Actually, he could, and we would have to know what level of inspection it was. If he got a level 1 inspection and was sent down the road with no violations found, they would put a CVSA sticker on the vehicle. That would give the officer at the next site a clue that the vehicle met those criteria and would not inspect it. If they were out of the CVSA sticker, then they would ask for the last inspection report that the driver would have with him. He would look at it and then would send them on down the road. Now, if they did a level 3 or a 2 and went down the road with no violation, and they come into a scale that was doing next truck up day and doing level 1, then I would think that there'd be a good possibility that he would receive another inspection and possibly get another no violations inspection done.
And so that would help the safety rating for that particular fleet, would it not?
Yes, it would. Any inspection with no violations on it helps the carriers. And, I encourage them to volunteer when they can. Just understand that if they volunteer and they go ahead and do the inspection, the officers will document any violations they find. So make sure everything is in extremely good shape before you volunteer for an inspection.
So if a driver were to ask for an inspection in a weigh station, do the officers there have to do an inspection?
Not in Texas, they do not. But it's the up to the discretion again of the officer if he has the time, and if in Texas they want to have two officers there to do a level 1 inspection. So if there's only one, then more than likely they wouldn't do anything but a level 2. So and I know they're looking to try to get the CVSA sticker, so that's going to have to be a level 1 inspection. Other states, and I don't know, they may have a mandatory. If you go in and ask, they have to, do the inspection, but I'm not sure if there's which states it would be.
Okay. So it really does depend too on the availability of certified inspectors in the station as well.
Correct.
Okay. Do you think most drivers have a good understanding of the FMCSA regulations?
I think it's gotten better over the years, and I think it will continue to get better as everybody comes more in tune to what it takes to go down the road and not receive a bad inspection.
Do you think do you notice a difference in understanding between, say, owner operators and company drivers?
I actually believe the owner operators may have a little bit of heads up on the rest of the company drivers, especially if they have a small fleet and they're really only concentrating on the one truck. Now I say that kind of twofold because in every profession you have your rock stars, and you have your rocks and everything in between. So there's some people that buy a truck and they have real no idea how to maintain it and what it takes, and then you have other guys that have been in the industry for a long time and are very sharp and diligent and take the time to learn their craft. And it's the same thing in law enforcement.
Well put. We've got a question around CVSA stickers. CVSA stickers come in different colors, and I believe they're coded by month. To see how recently they received a CVSA inspection. How does this influence the officer's discretion inside the station?
Well, a CVSA sticker is good for 90 days, and they are color coded, and it also which corner is taken off plays a part into it. So a officer can look at the CVSA sticker and tell that it was issued, within the first month of the quarter, within the middle month of the quarter, and within the last month of the quarter. So, it's just they can look at it and tell which one it's supposed to be when it was done. If it was done, 60 days ago, they might look at it again a little bit closer. They could inspect it if they wanted to, but probably would still send it on down the road and not inspect it.
Right. An add-on to that question is, how is that used, in the Drivewyze system? And I think I can answer that one. Drivewyze would not look at the most recent inspection for a particular vehicle. We would look at the overall sort of inspection history of a truck and or carrier. And so the weighting of whether or not that truck needs to pull in or not would be based off the overall score. One of the questions from the audience is, why does it sometimes seem that regulations are interpreted differently between states?
You know,
you can take that one back?
I don't know how to. I really don't know how to answer that. To me, they're pretty straightforward. And if there is a question that arises commonly, then you have to go to the interpretation. I will say that, there's some inspectors out there that really work hard and diligent on their craft, and there's others that do not, and mistakes can be made.
Okay. What do you know what types of violations have a larger impact on a carrier safety score?
Definitely your out of service violations and your moving traffic violations. Those are going to have a higher impact to your scores.
Okay. Well, so what would your advice be to drivers to get a better understanding of FMCSA regulations?
It takes training. If they're a owner-operator, then they're going to have to train themselves. If they're a bigger company, well, then the company needs to really strive to provide education and training for the drivers, and not only just presenting them in class, but have them take tests. We do that in law enforcement. We'll show up at an area meeting and somebody will pop out a test just to see where everybody's knowledge is at. And then they will come up with training based on the results of that test. Continual training is the only way we can all get better at our craft.
Right. Another question from the audience is, can my driver receive a citation even though they received the bypass?
Yes, they could. Just because they received a bypass does not mean that an officer couldn't go ahead and leave the site and come down and inspect their vehicle.
So should they do an inspection post the way station? Obviously, anything that is out of compliance wouldn't receive a citation, correct?
Correct. They just wouldn't receive a citation for bypassing the scale. Okay, great. Just checking to see here if we have any other questions. How often do you choose to inspect vehicles that fall under the 10,000 pound rule rather than the 26,000 pound rule? Well, if they're under 10,000 pounds, they don't fall under the federal motor carrier safety regulations. Now, if they fall between 10,001 and 26,000, that's the interstate rules. And 26,001 pound is an intrastate rule. So it depends upon what they're doing at the time of inspection. If they're an interstate load, then we inspect them at 10,001 pound and above. If they're an intrastate load, we usually go with the 26,000. Most states do. There are a couple of states I know that are out there that their intrastate is 18,000 pounds. So it just depends upon what the load is at that particular point in time, whether it's an interstate load or an intrastate load. Okay, question from the audience. What if a driver has an inspection, is found to be out of service, then the officer escorts the driver to a repair shop to get the violation repaired? What happens to the company and driver's score? Do officers typically escort them to repair shops? We try to. I mean, we try to work with them, with everybody. If we can escort them to a repair facility of their choice, we'll do that as long as it's, close, usually within, 5 to 6 miles. And, as long as it can be done safely. As far as the scores go, it doesn't matter if they prepare it right then and let go once the inspection is done. Those violations will be placed on their carrier profile and the driver profile. Okay,
Okay, so citations are already given at that point. Them taking it to a station to get repaired just really just allows them to continue on with the load from there, rather than being put out of service and parked in the way station. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and it saves the company's money. That's why we do it. You know, we're not out there to, you know, penalize the companies. If they're not making money, well then, you know, they wouldn't be in business. So we do our best to work within the guidelines that we have in order to help the carriers where we can.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Let me look for additional questions here. What is the likelihood a driver will be inspected if they have a high ISS score, 10 to 20%, versus the likely to be inspected with lower scores, 75 to 85%? So I think that one when it comes to the way station bypass anyways, we would not look at the driver's ISS score or CSA scores. We do look at the fleets. The ranges for bypass vary. So somebody with a lower score would probably bypass anywhere between 80 to 98%, depending on the random pulling rates set by enforcement. But when it comes to inspections, Doug, how do the ISS scores impact an officer's decision to inspect the vehicle?
No, I would say it's pretty rare that they look the score up before stopping the trucks. There are a few officers out there that would not run a score and to decide whether to inspect it based off that score, but that's pretty. I'd say that's pretty rare that they would do that. If the score is high and they did run it, then I would say the likelihood of it being inspected is much higher.
Now, for local carriers that typically drive the same routes or driving by the same scale houses, I imagine officers come to know who those fleets are, would they not?
Once you've had quite a bit of tenure, especially in one location, you do become aware of the local driving, local companies, local carriers, and their whether or not there's going to be violations on the truck or not. That they'll know that. If even your bigger carriers that come through there, they're going to know those too. But definitely the locals, they'll know which ones are more compliant than the others, and take enforcement action as needed.
So what would your tips or recommendations be to carriers and drivers on how they might be able to build good reputations with law enforcement?
The best thing to do is to go in and take the time to visit with the officers, especially if you're a local carrier that works in the same area all the time. Go in and visit with them. Ask them questions. Find out from them what the carriers can do to become more compliant. If one particular area, the vehicles the brakes are always in bad shape, well, work on the brakes, get compliant. They may even have programs where they could come out and come to your site and talk to your mechanics and show them what they're looking for. There's no secrets into what the officers are actually doing. It's very straightforward as far as inspecting the vehicles. But build a relationship, a professional relationship with the officers, and that'll help. I know that in my situation, the local drivers, we built a very good rapport with them, and a lot of times they would call us on the CB and help us find drunks and get us to accidents sooner than even being dispatched to them. So, it's definitely a teamwork, and if you'll build that team, it'll make it safer for everybody, both the carriers and the motoring public.
That's great. Doug, one of the things we see happen in a number of states is more and more use of pop-up inspection locations. Do you know, is the criteria used in these pop-up scales the same as it is in the fixed stations when it comes to either pulling in or bypassing?
What do you mean by pop-up wait stations?
Like the mobile inspection facilities that enforcement may set up in a rest area or a pull-out area and do random inspections.
There again, it's if well, in our case, as far as Drivewyze, if that site is a Drivewyze site that they use, they could possibly get bypasses there also. But as far as the inspections go, I would say the criteria is about the same. We're still going to look at them and make a determination whether to inspect them once they come in.
Got it. We've got a couple of questions around ELDs, but I believe you retired before the ELD mandate came in fact, right?
That is correct.
Were you familiar much with reading logs off ELDs, or were at that time were they still required to keep a paper copy of it?
Well, when I was on the road, it was definitely the paper logs. The ELDs came in after my stint on the highway. The officers will have a learning curve, learning how to properly evaluate the ELDs and things of that nature, and they will get good at reading them. But it's definitely up to the drivers to be able to show them where their time remaining is, things of that nature, how many hours they've driven, all that type of information.
Okay.
Hope that answers.
Well, I would encourage. Yeah, and I would encourage those folks on the phone today, if you have specific questions around ELDs and how enforcement is monitoring those today, send them in. We can always bring those questions to our existing law enforcement users on the field, and we can email you some responses back that way as well. A couple more questions here, more specific about the program itself. One of the questions we get is scales that use weigh in motion on the main line. Some people have heard they won't provide bypasses unless the driver is using a transponder. Is that true? No, that's not true. Drivewyze was the first weigh station bypass program to integrate with mainline weigh in motion scales wirelessly. We do receive those weight recordings, and we do use that as part of the screen criteria. And today, Drivewyze is supported over 700 locations. Over 100 of those today are integrated with weigh in motion. So Drivewyze works perfectly fine at those locations. We've only got another minute or two here, Doug, so maybe we'll wrap it up. And I thought before we go, I mean, you've been an officer on the side of the road for a number of years. Do you have any funny stories or anecdotes you'd like to share before we sign off?
I guess I have a couple of them. lot of the times we stop vehicles going down the highway, and the first words out of the driver's mouth is, "What'd you stop me for?" This particular one, a guy was driving a 5-axle rig and was hauling some trusses, wooden trusses, and he was dragging them down the highway. And of course, I pulled him over and stopped him. First thing out of his mouth was, "What are you stopping me for?" And I said, "Well, because you're dragging your load down the highway." Yeah, that was and I really don't think he knew it. And it wasn't just like one piece of wood. It was about half the load was just being dragged down the highway. But probably one of the it's funny now. It wasn't funny at the time, but I was talking to a driver. I was standing on his running board. I was looking at his logbook, and anyway, I was on US 75 and a lot of traffic, but I kind of hear a big truck coming, and I know everybody's heard a flat tire going down when it's going down the road. So, and right as I turned to look, another big truck was coming by, and a chunk of rubber come off and hit me in the side of the head. You know, knocked me off the running board. Good thing it was on the rear on the trailer. But I hit the ground. I jumped up, picked my hat up, and the driver that I was talking to said, "He's going to get a ticket, isn't he?" And I said, I'll let y'all figure out whether he got the ticket or not.
All right. Thanks, Doug. Well, for you folks on the phone, if we didn't get a chance to answer any of your questions, or if you think of something after the webinar, feel free to submit them. We'd be happy to get back to you via email after the webinar. If you have any questions specifically about the Drivewyze program or any of the technologies used by Drivewyze or IIS, or if you have any enforcement-related questions, happy to bring those to the enforcement folks that we work with. And like we said, we work with a number of them in almost every jurisdiction. So we'll do our best to get you answers to those questions as soon as we can. I'll turn it over to you, Haley.
Awesome. Thank you both for the valuable insight and information you shared this afternoon. And Doug, your stories, they were a lot of fun. And we'd like to also thank Drivewyze for making today's presentation possible. We'd also like to thank you, our listeners, for attending today's webinar. We hope you learned something new about how waste stations operate and how bypassing scales can help your company save time and improve efficiency. If you have any questions, like Doug and Brian were mentioning, and we were unable to address them, or you have just additional questions, you can submit them by just replying to the email that you were sent today with the GoToWebinars login information, and those will go to the correct people. If you would like to view the webinar again or send it to someone else in your company, you can download it by going to ccjdigital.com/webinars. You will also receive a full recording of today's webinar via email this time tomorrow. Thank you again for listening, and have a great day.